Good. Sorry.
You okay?
Yeah. Okay. Hello, everyone. Does this work?
Yeah.
Okay, fantastic. Hi, everyone. So, my name is Chiara Di Leone, and thank you so much, Suhail, for the introduction. And thank you so much for inviting me to be part of this great lecture series. I'm very happy to be starting off today with a talk that's titled "It Was All Bad, but It All Made Sense." So, first of all, I wanted to say how narrative features in my work and how I relate to this topic. So my interest in narrative is twofold. So first, I'm a writer, so this is the craft that I struggle to improve and practice, and obviously narrative is a very important part of it, though it's not the only way to do it. But most importantly, narrative is I'm interested in the relationship between the sciences and narrative modes of representation. So because I will give two talks, so one is today and one is next week, I thought it would be a good idea to sort of try and connect them. So today we will look at how storytelling interfaces with scientific processes. We will look at how knowledge changes when it's squished into the straitjacket of the story and how it does not have to be that way. In particular, we will look at how climate science is represented and made sense of through the use of narrative modes of representation. Next week, we will look at a specific type of narrative, one subset, that is the kind of doomer narratives. We will look at the sad, alarming, dystopian ones, the ones that for some reason seem to stick. So we will attempt to do a genealogy of these doomer stories that start around in the 1970s with the Limits to Growth report that I'm sure most of you are familiar with. And we will look at other forms of narratives that emerged at the same time, but that were ultimately discarded. So because this is the first talk of the series, I thought that it would be useful to revisit an essay that I wrote 2 years ago and that was published in Tank magazine. Just to kind of give us a few conceptual tools to kind of explore this topic of narratives together. But before we kind of dive into this, I kind of wanted to preface this essay with a few consideration, a few things that kind of have been upgrading my thinking ever since I wrote this. So the first consideration is that since then there's been a few articles that have come out that question the value of narrative in representing climate change, but also the value of narrative at large and its ubiquity. This article, for instance, came out in the New Yorker last July by Perul Segal, and it is it's an article that problematizes narrative. I'm gonna cite a few quotes from it. So among the other entities, storytelling has been taught to save wildlife, water, conservatism, your business, our streets, newspapers, medicine, the movies, San Francisco, and meaning itself. Story is our mother tongue, the argument runs. For the sake of comprehension and care, we must be spoken in story. Story has elbowed out everything else, from the lyric to the logical argument, even the straightforward news dispatch. In 2020, the Times media columnist wrote that the publication was evolving, quote, from the stodgy paper of record into a juicy collection of great narratives. There's been also quite a lot of text and opinions that came out around scientific publishing and publishing around climate change specifically. So this piece basically talks about the experience of this author, climate scientist that published his paper in Nature, and that in order to do so, he argues that he had to omit certain important details, and that basically had to conform to what nature was expecting him and his team to write. So just to kind of summarize his story, he says that the paper they just published in Nature, Climate Warming Increases Extreme Daily Wildfire Growth Risk in California, focuses exclusively on how climate change has affected extreme wildfire behavior, and that he didn't try to quantify key aspects other than climate change because it would dilute the story that prestigious journals like Nature want to tell. He argues that this matters because it is critically important for scientists to be published in high-profile journals, and in many ways they're the gatekeepers for career success in academia. And he concludes by saying that, to put it bluntly, climate science has become less about understanding the complexities of the world and more about serving as a kind of Cassandra, urgently warning the public about the dangers of climate change. However understandable the instinct may be, it distorts a great deal of climate science research, misinforms the public, and most importantly, makes practical solutions more difficult to achieve. Now, of course, we also must look at the motives behind this kind of expose. This author, then it turns out that he works for an institute that it's quite more the Breakthrough Institute, that is part of an eco-modernist sort of philosophy. And so, of course, it's like other motives to push this narrative. But the point is there has been a lot of conversation in the media, and the public become more and more aware of the role of the narrative's model representation of very complex topics like climate change. What I would like to talk about as well before going into the sort of essay is to historicize this kind of debates for a minute. So I read a lot of Professor Aidan White's work from the 80s, and especially there is this book that's called The Content of the Form, where he basically tries to argue that narrative is far from being merely a form of discourse that can be filled with different contents, real or imaginary as the case may be, but narrative already possesses a content prior to any given actualization of it in speech or writing. And this is exactly the content of the form that Hayden White is referring to. In this book, he also presents other non-narrative ways of doing history, because he was doing historiography. That's the discipline of how to write history, so that's his field. So these other ways of doing history, one of them is, for example, writing annals, like the one that you're seeing, which is the Annal of St. Gall, where you just have events pointed out and written in this very apparently logical way. Say 712, floods everywhere, Pippin, mayor of the place, died, Charles devastated the Saxon, Saracens came for the first time, and things like that. So, and there are even some events missing, but what he argues that the author of these annals it's not that he was not smart enough to see the causal relationships between this event and to make a good story out of it. It is just that these kinds of documents were sort of facts oriented, and there was a whole different kind of discourse around it, and that storytelling at that point was not the only way to do history, for example. So what I also did was I'm naturally a strong interest in screenwriting, because I work for a film production company, and I had to learn how to read and evaluate a script. And this book that you're seeing is one of the best-selling books and the most used in the screenwriting industry. And it kind of shows how the sausage is made. Like, how do you write a story? What are the elements of a story? How to convince anybody that of anything, basically. John Truby is one of the most respected and sought-after story consultant in the film industry. And quoting from Google Books, his students have gone to pen some of Hollywood's most successful films, including Sleepless in Seattle, Scream, and Shrek. One of the things that I found most striking in this book was this. So this is a depiction of some patterns that are found in some basic story patterns. And the author argues that these patterns are also found in nature. So for example, the meandering story is the form of rivers, snakes, and the brain, while the explosive story is also found in volcanoes and dandelions. So I just find it interesting there is this kind of naturalistic fallacy that further tries to convince the reader that story is just the best and the only way to represent reality. Also because it's found in nature. So, but there is a good point here to be made that stories are very ubiquitous, and stories are our preferred, allegedly, way to make sense of reality. So, why problematizing this form of representation? Why is this not good enough? If it is so transnational, it's so ubiquitous, it's always been there. So the reason why I think narrative should be challenged is that I think as humans we have matured a body of knowledge that far exceeds the realm of narrative. So we could learn how to be well versed in techniques of representation that interface with more complex languages. Could we do that, or are we doomed to stick to narratives and stories as the only valuable way to represent reality? Now let's get into the main question of this lecture, which is on the use of the narrative mode of representation in climate sciences and the role that art and literature have within it. So, it is difficult, if not impossible, to write about narrative critically. The very technology being critiqued is the only one available to articulate what's wrong with it. Sure enough, the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house, but the inverse is also true. Too often the master's tools won't fix the master's house either. The abundance of narratives about climate change is a case in point. The biggest authority on the issue, the Intergovernmental Panel for Climate Change, regularly writes story-like reports that rehearse the culmination of decades of environmental degradation, either into catastrophic tipping points or utopian green capitalist pastures. And here you see one examples of the IPCC sort of narratives. There's five of them. They are called socioeconomic pathways, SSPs, and they are this kind of simplified path forwards that help climate modelers forecast what may happen in the coming 50 or 100 years based on these fictional scenarios. Similarly, the literary genre of climate fiction renders imaginary world where catastrophic climate change finally builds up to some apocalyptic event. Once a week, Bloomberg Green conveniently summarizing climate news in a newsletter. Most recently, after the release of the 6th IPCC report in August, it sent out a column condensing the IPCC emission scenarios into 5 digestible takeaways because, quote, no one wants to sift through that much scientific jargon. We will do it for you. When it comes to making sense of phenomena that happen at a planetary scale, it is unclear how hyper-simplified versions of reality that compete for the viewer, user's, or reader's attention, disdain, or empathy make it any more possible to act upon these changes. It is hard to shake away the suspicion that stories will not help humanities to get out of a mess that is much more complex than both the punitive, corporate responsibility-infused Bloomberg Green columns and dystopian tomes of climate fiction make it look. When talking about climate technology, one may think of solar radiation management, ocean fertilization, cloud seeding, carbon sequestration, and the like. But the way that we articulate the climate problem is, in and of itself, as a technology as strong, if not stronger, than its high-tech brick-and-mortar counterparts. In her essay, A Rant About Technology, Ursula Le Guin reclaims the softer qualities of low-tech and defines technology as the way society copes with physical reality. If technology is the active human interface with the material world, then stories and more generally sense-making are also climate technologies in their own right. But storytelling is just one of many technologies through which humans understand the planet, but not one which the planet is, but it is one that towards which the planet is very indifferent to. To be sure, the planet is not indifferent towards other sense-making tools like climate science, for example. So many academics have built their careers on trying to narrativize the planet and its atmosphere with the aim of overcoming its intrinsic unnarratability. Climate change, they've said, is not story-like because of its slow violence. Nothing ever happens, there is no tragedy, no big calamity. Instead, glaciers melt slowly while CO2 concentration increases fast enough for sensors to detect, but not enough for our lungs to register a meaningful change. It is a gradual process, meaning its fatal impact is not always visible. It is incremental, dispersed across time and space, and therefore often not perceived as a type of violence. The problem is, in short, that climate change does not lend itself to the narrative form of representation. So one of the proposed solutions against slow violence has been to simulate this largely and likely unexperienced phenomena into narrative form, which can render violence very effectively through its eventual culmination in catastrophic events, in black or white, on a page or a tome, or even on a screen. The idea of anticipating many of the sufferings that we might have been about to experience on page or screen so that we avoid actually experiencing them, learning from mistakes before having made them, was not such a bad idea, at least in principle. But nonsense and lack of linear narrative are registered as problems only by our cognition, not by the planetary ecosystems that we are part of. By the way, here is a headline from The Guardian, I believe, where there are some very good works in climate fiction. But the point that I'm trying to make here is not that climate fiction is bad. It's just simply that it does the work of kind of squishing very complex phenomena into the straitjacket of the story, which is very, very kind of precise structure of itself. So, following the latest IPCC reports and scientific consensus, there finally seem to be clear actors doing clearly bad things, and one hopes eventually paying for the consequences. In summer 2021, we learned the phrase heat dome. Extreme weather events are now happening in Germany, not only in Bangladesh. This last year has proven that climate change is no longer a distant threat, said Catherine Hyo, chief scientist at the Nature Conservancy. We can no longer assume that citizens of more affluent and secure countries like Canada, Germany, Japan, and the United States will be able to ride out the worst excesses of a rapidly destabilizing climate. End quote. Mind you, natural disasters as a direct result of climate change have been around for much longer, but they have been way too far from Western academic campuses for any established scientific committee to unanimously declare the link obvious. So, as it should be clear by now, the fact that climate change phenomena map onto the structure of the story, which could be summarized as causality, linearity, and catastrophic events, is not something that is terribly used to our survival. Stories are formulaic, predictable, and just very old. In his 1965 lecture, Cybernetics and Ghosts, Italo Calvino, way ahead of ChatGPT, wrote about stories as technologies of permutation that are so repeatable as to be one day completely automatable. When stories evolved together with the cognition of early humans gathering in tribes, the extreme poverty of ideas about the world then available to them was matched by this detailed and seemingly all-embracing technology. Stories emerged as a flawed but flexible standing for interfacing with actual knowledge of worldly phenomena, not necessarily as a means of acquiring such knowledge, but the confusion is one that is proving hard to articulate, let alone overcome. Italo Calvino also published a collection of 200 Italian folk tales in 1965. He began the project in 1954, influenced by Soviet folklorist Vladimir Prop's morphology of the folk tale. But after traveling across the entire peninsula to gather and codify local tales, he discovered that they differ only marginally across Italian regions. There is always a good and a bad character being glorified or punished for their actions, like in the money can do anything tale from Genova, or magic forces saving the virtuous characters in need, as in The Serpent King from Calabria. If the geographical focus of Calvino's project makes it seem like a cultural bias is at play, works like World Tales by author Idris Shah show that such narrative devices are tools shared by all humankind. Today, just as the richness of ideas and knowledge about the world continues to grow, the narrative code stays primordially the same. The cognitive shackles of the narrative drive are both hard to recognize and to break from, but that does not mean we should not try. Throughout the history of literature, frustration around storytelling have often bubbled up because its appeasing, subjective, and linear nature has long been counterproductive to achieving political and larger-than individual ambitions. For instance, in the biography of the object, 1929, Soviet playwright Sergei Tetyakov writes about the need to, quote, run a human along the narrative conveyor belt like an object, end quote. Rather than using the device of the hero, who he found was getting in the way of socialism. In the classical novel that is based upon the individual's hero's biography, the relative scale of the character is largely reminiscent of an Egyptian wall paint he wrote. The colossal hero is on the throne at the center. Near him, in a slightly smaller size, is his wife. Still smaller are the ministers and army commanders. And finally, in the faceless heaps of copper coins is the entire varied mass of the population, the servants, the soldiers, the slaves. The hero is what holds the novel's universe together. The whole world is perceived through him. The whole world is furthermore essentially just a collection of details that belong to him. In order to determine the power of this idealism in the novel, you have only to consider the weight within it of the objective world, relative to the weight of the subjective world, the world of emotions and experiences. For Tretyakov, the straitjacket of the novel was way too subjective and human-centered to convey the materialism needed to articulate and practice socialism. Today, similarly, the excessive weight placed on experience can be seen in the narratives around planetary catastrophes and doomsday scenarios. The psychological aspects of catastrophe are too seductive to give way to more alienating forms of understanding the world where, crucially, the subjective experience of the character is necessarily secondary to the material reality of the world they live in. In the psychological plot described by Tretyakov, events follow one another in a fatalist theology. He proposed the biography of the object as an antidote to that, a literature organized around the act. Thus, not the individual person moving through a system of objects, but the object proceeding through the system of people. For literature, this is the methodological device that seems to us more progressive than those of classical belles-lettres. And here we can see one of his assistants making this conveyor belt-like set for one of the plays that he wrote. Tretyakov was fighting different monsters that we are now, but we can still learn from his critique of the novel today and see some of his outdated streaks in the idealist and moralizing character of climate narratives. Seeing humans as objects just like any other scrolling on a conveyor belt might be a useful technique to begin to dismantling of contemporary psychodrama tropes. The first step to getting out of a trap, after all, is to recognize you're in it. And this requires a certain degree of distance from our experience. If we were to experiment with this kind of alienation, it might allow us to see man in his full worth, a powerful biped who was able to shape the planet accidentally and semi-intentionally in ways that might cause his own demise. Considering humans as objects should not be mistaken for taking agency away from them by picturing them as impotent and minuscule, but rather as a means to see humanity from outside the immediacy of human experience. In doing so, we might learn to acknowledge both our power and our danger to planetary ecosystems, and therefore to ourselves. Umberto Eco also wrote extensively about narratives, and specifically about leaving this very long quote here, but we'll get there. So Umberto Eco also wrote extensively about narratives, and specifically about the necessity of alienation as a fundamental goal of meaningful literature. He was concerned with rendering and articulating alienation artistically. In his book, The Open Work, published in 1962, he brought about the hardwired technologies of storytelling, asking how it might be possible to get out of a, quote, language that has already done so much speaking, end quote. His idea of form as social commitment revealed the ways in which the process of writing applies a descriptive model to an objective reality. In other words, form as social commitment consists of building a literary, aesthetic, and discursive world on top of the reality and objectivity of the planet in ways that break with past traditions. In these ways, attempts to articulate the world differently are directed towards changing the material world itself through a more recursive understanding of it. The artist, for Eco, stands outside of the established communication paradigms and does not conform to existing modes of knowledge. Rather, they create new ones in order to express what is impossible to say with the tools at hand. In its most ambitious form, literature would express our relationship to the object of our knowledge and our concern with the form we have given the world, or the form we have failed to give it, and would try to provide our imagination with schemes without which we might not be able to understand a large part of our technical and scientific activity. In the multitude of the schemes available to us, the story is, once again, just one of many. One way to do this is to acknowledge that the world, that is, the mental images about the material reality of the planet as objects on a conveyor belt, can only be built as modified nature, as man-made work. To this, Calvino would have probably countered Eco's proposal for the reframing of narrative outside of the human experience by stating that there is no way the author can escape what is human. His practical and literary articulation of his thought was to anthropomorphize non-human characters while using established structures of literature. But Calvino was at least knowledgeable about his human cognitive shortcomings, with his work both accommodating at the same time dislodging these limitations in a gracious way. For instance, in his Cosmic Comics collection, the anthropomorphism of the characters is so explicit, infantile, and absurd that it serves the purpose of dislodging the human, moving by means of ridicule from the pharaonic throne of the protagonist in the hero's journey. So, after all, a literature that tries to express in its openness and indeterminacy the vertiginous and hypothetical universe perceived by the scientific imagination is still concerned with mankind, since it tries to define a universe that has assumed its present configuration thanks to a human process of modeling reality. The apparent contradictory sense-making approaches of anthropocentrism, anthropomorphism, and alienation do not then exclude each other, but are strategies that should be used in tandem to grapple with the reality riddled with the very same contradictions. What I argue is that we need new literary technologies to match the complexity and richness of our scientific knowledge about the planet. These are the ones that transcend the comfort of narratives, not by creating more of them, but by inventing a new form of literature altogether. These new tools tend to be recursive and programmable, like the feedback loops that they're trying to model, scientifically rigorous and ambiguously open at once. The seeds of these literatures and literacies already exist. They are in statistical analysis, weather prediction, cognitive sciences, cybernetic remnants, poetry, astronomy, forest ecosystems, and climate simulations. There are many new non-stories, worlds and models looming across the horizon, but none of them will be accessed until we are brave enough to let go of the comfort of making sense. Thank you.